"I'll marry you if you fit into this royal gown, fat scullery maid." The words cracked through the grand gallery of Ashford Manor like a whip against bare skin. Duke Edward Thornhill's voice echoed off the marble walls, bouncing between golden candelabras that dripped with crystal teardrops, each one catching the gaslight and throwing fragments of cruel brightness across the assembled aristocracy. The year was 1868, and London's finest had gathered for the unveiling of the season's most exquisite gowns, but the true spectacle that November evening would be something far more savage. "I'll marry you if you fit into this royal gown," the Duke repeated louder this time, his manicured finger pointing directly at Rose Bennet, who knelt on the cold marble floor with a scrub brush in her calloused hands. The crimson silk dress he indicated hung on a mannequin like a banner of war, impossibly fitted, shimmering with imported French embroidery that caught light like liquid rubies. It was a gown designed for a woman half Rose's size, cut for the waist of a ballerina, tailored for someone who had never known hunger or hard labor. The laughter erupted like thunder. It rolled through the gallery in waves, starting with Lady Catherine Pemberton's high-pitched shriek of delight and spreading to Lord Beaumont's deep belly laugh, then catching fire among the younger set until the entire room shook with collective cruelty. The sound was not just noise, it was a physical force that pressed against Rose's chest, making it hard to breathe. The crystal chandeliers above seemed to vibrate with malicious joy, their 1,000 prisms scattering rainbow mockery across the polished floor. Have you ever felt this way? Invisible, disposable, less than. If you've ever been in a moment where someone made you feel small, you know what Rose felt right then. That burning mixture of shame and rage that sits in your throat like swallowed glass. Duke Edward Thornhill stood at the center of it all, magnificent in his tailored midnight blue coat with gold buttons that probably cost more than Rose's entire family had earned in a decade. His pocket watch chain glinted, his diamond cufflinks sparkled, and his boots were so polished they reflected the gaslight like black mirrors. He was 32 years old, heir to one of England's most substantial fortunes, owner of 7 estates, and at this moment the architect of Rose Bennet's public destruction. His smile was the smile of a man who had never been told no, who had never faced consequence, who believed the world existed for his entertainment. Around him clustered his usual admirers. Reginald Fitzwilliam, whose family owned half of Yorkshire, laughed so hard he spilled champagne on his white gloves. Victoria Ashford, the Duke's cousin and hostess of this evening's gathering, fanned herself dramatically as if the scandal might cause her to faint from sheer delight. Behind them, a dozen other nobles formed a circle of judgment, their expensive perfumes mixing with beeswax candles to create an atmosphere so thick with privilege it was almost suffocating. Rose Bennet remained on her knees, the scrub brush still gripped in her right hand, her other hand pressed flat against the marble. She was 23 years old, but looked older, worn down by years of service that had started when she was barely 12. Her dark hair, tied back in a simple cloth, had escaped in wisps that stuck to her forehead with sweat. Her servant's dress, grey and shapeless, was damp at the knees from the soapy water she'd been using to clean. Her face, which might have been pretty under different circumstances, was now burning crimson with shame that spread from her cheeks down her neck. But if you looked closely at Rose Bennet, if you were paying attention to something other than the spectacle of her humiliation, you might have noticed something in her eyes, a spark, a flicker of something that was not quite defeat. Her jaw was clenched, yes, but not in weakness. Her hands trembled, but they did not drop the brush. And when she finally looked up at the Duke, there was something in that gaze that would haunt him later, though he did not recognize it then. What secret did those calm eyes hold? How could a simple scullery maid possess such hidden certainty? The grand gallery itself seemed designed to amplify her shame. The walls were covered in damask silk wallpaper imported from France, deep burgundy and gold that cost more per yard than Rose earned in a month. Oil paintings in gilded frames depicted centuries of Thornhill ancestors, all gazing down with the same expression of entitled superiority that now animated their descendant's face. "Come now," Duke Edward continued, warming to his audience like an actor on a stage. "Surely our dear Rose has dreams of bettering herself. Don't all you servants dream of marrying into wealth?" He swept his arm in a theatrical gesture. "Here is your chance, girl. Stand up, approach the gown. Let us see if destiny favours you tonight." More laughter. Lord Beaumont slapped his thigh. Lady Pemberton whispered something to her companion that sent them both into fits of giggles. A young lordling at the back mimicked the motion of trying to squeeze into something too small. To the delight of his friends, the cruelty was casual, thoughtless, the kind that comes from people who have never questioned their right to diminish others. Rose's cheeks burned hotter. She could feel every eye on her, could sense the weight of their judgment pressing down like a physical thing. Her first instinct was to flee, to drop the brush and run from this nightmare, to lose herself in the servants' corridors where she belonged, where she was invisible. That was what they expected. That was the proper ending to this little entertainment. But then something happened. Something small but significant. Rose's eyes fell on the crimson gown, and for just a moment she saw not an instrument of torture, but a challenge. Not a joke, but a promise. All of us have faced moments like this, when someone tries to make us feel we don't belong, that we're not enough. This isn't just Rose's story. It's the story of every person who's had to choose between accepting humiliation or defending their dignity. But what no one in that ballroom knew was that Rose Bennet carried something they could never understand. A mother's last words that burned in her heart like an eternal flame. Rose set down the brush with deliberate care. The small sound of wood against marble cut through the laughter. She placed her hands on the floor and pushed herself to her feet, her knees protesting from the long hours of scrubbing. The movement was slow, controlled, and somehow it commanded attention. The laughter began to falter, not stopping entirely, but shifting in tone, becoming uncertain. She stood in her soaked grey dress, water dripping onto the pristine marble, her rough hands hanging at her sides. She did not speak. She did not need to. In that moment of rising, Rose Bennet made a silent vow that would change everything. The aristocracy could laugh now. They could mock her body, her station, her very existence. But that night, beneath the weight of their scorn, a different kind of strength was being forged. Duke Edward's smile widened. He thought her standing was submission, the first step in his entertainment. He could not have known that Rose's standing was not surrender, but declaration, a line drawn, a promise made. "Excellent," the Duke purred, mistaking her defiance for compliance. "Let us see what fate has in store." But Rose did not move toward the gown. Instead, she looked at it, memorizing every line, every seam, every impossible measurement. Her hands, calloused from years of work, flexed slightly at her sides. Those hands recognized patterns, understood construction in ways the aristocracy never would. Then she looked at the Duke, and in her eyes was something that would have chilled him if he had been wise enough to see it. Not hatred, something colder. Determination. If this story has already touched your heart, tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from, and leave your like so we can keep sharing stories that inspire and move people around the world. Rose turned and walked from the gallery, not running, not rushing, but moving with a dignity that surprised even herself. Behind her, the laughter resumed, louder than before, feeding on itself, growing into something monstrous. But Rose no longer heard it. In her mind, she was already somewhere else, already planning, already beginning the transformation that would make mockery of their mockery. That night, In the tiny attic room she shared with two other servants, Rose Bennet wept. She wept hot, bitter tears that soaked her thin pillow and made her chest ache. She wept for the girl she had been, for the mother she had lost 3 years ago to consumption, for every moment of her life that had led to this humiliation. But somewhere in the depths of those tears, shame was crystallizing into something harder, something unbreakable. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was no longer in the cold attic. The small wash-house behind their tenement smelled of lye soap and steam. The air was thick and hot, making it hard to breathe. Her mother, Margaret Bennet, stood at the massive washing tub, her hands red and raw from the scalding water. Despite the harsh work, she maintained her dignity, her spine straight, even as exhaustion pulled at her shoulders. She had pricked her finger again, and a small drop of blood stained the white fabric. Because, my love, their need to diminish us proves how much they fear what we could become if we ever truly believed in ourselves. Never give them that satisfaction. Never. Always her mother's words. Your worth is not measured by their opinion of you. Perhaps you've had someone in your life who believed in you when no one else did. A mother, a grandmother, a teacher who saw your worth when you couldn't see it yourself. Those voices never truly leave us, do they? The City of London in 1868 was a place of stark divisions. In the West End, where Ashford Manor stood, elegance and excess ruled. But in the East End, in neighbourhoods like Whitechapel, a different world existed. This was where Rose went 3 days after her humiliation, carrying her life savings of £2 and 7 shillings wrapped in a handkerchief, and carrying something far more valuable, a name, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. The name had been whispered to Rose by an older servant at the manor, a woman who had seen the aftermath of that terrible evening and whose eyes had held an unexpected sympathy. If you want to learn properly, the old woman had said, seek Eleanor Hartwell in Whitechapel. Tell her Mary Thornton sent you. Tell her you need to learn what they never wanted you to know. Rose found the address on a narrow street where laundry hung between buildings like banners of surrender, where children played in gutters, and where the smell of coal smoke mixed with the Thames to create an atmosphere thick enough to chew. The building was shabby but clean, its windows covered with simple curtains that had been mended multiple times. Rose knocked, her heart hammering, half expecting to be turned away. The woman who opened the door was perhaps 50, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, hands marked by years of work, and eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to truth. She wore a simple dark dress, but there was something in the way she held herself, in the straightness of her spine, that spoke of different times. "Mrs. Hartwell?" Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am. Mary Thornton sent me. I need to learn." Those grey eyes studied Rose for a long moment, taking in the calluses on her hands, the determined set of her jaw, the desperation barely held in check. Then Mrs. Hartwell stepped aside. "Come in!" The interior was a revelation. Where the exterior promised poverty, the inside spoke of refined taste constrained by circumstance. The furniture was old but elegant. The walls lined with fashion plates and drawings, a work table covered with fabrics and measuring tools. In one corner stood a dress form, and on it hung a partially completed gown of such beauty that Rose caught her breath. "You were a seamstress to the Queen," Rose said, the words not a question, but a recognition of the quality she saw before her. "I was." Mrs. Hartwell's voice was matter-of-fact, neither proud nor ashamed. 15 years in Her Majesty's service, creating gowns for state occasions, balls that shaped the course of nations, until my husband died and certain accusations were made about materials that went missing, false accusations, but sufficient to end my employment and my reputation. She turned to Rose, and in her expression was a lifetime of understanding what it meant to fall from grace through no fault of your own. "Mary told me what happened at Ashford Manor." The entire servants' network has been speaking of it. Duke Thornhill's cruel game. Mrs. Hartwell paused, then asked the question that would determine everything. Why are you here, child? For revenge. Rose had thought about this, had examined her motives during the long nights since that terrible evening. Not revenge, she said slowly, carefully, because the truth mattered. For proof. To prove that cruelty does not define the person who suffers it, but the person who inflicts it. To prove that I am not what he made me seem. Mrs. Hartwell smiled then, a small smile but genuine. That, she said, is a goal worth pursuing. Very well, we begin tomorrow. But I warn you, Rose Bennet, this will not be easy. Creating that gown, making it fit you perfectly, learning not just to sew, but to embody elegance, that is a journey measured in months of discipline. I have time, Rose said, and I have nothing but determination. Then we start at dawn. Could you imagine dedicating 6 months of your life, every waking hour, to prove your worth to people who mocked you? Or would that fire of determination burn inside you too? The transformation of Rose Bennet began not with fabric and thread, but with understanding. Mrs. Hartwell was not merely a seamstress, but a philosopher of elegance, and her first lesson had nothing to do with sewing. True elegance, she told Rose on that first morning, as thin winter light filtered through the grimy windows, is not in the gown. It is not in the jewels or the breeding or the title. True elegance is in how you carry yourself, in the certainty that your worth does not depend on others' recognition of it. The gown is merely the external expression of an internal truth. They began with posture. Hours upon hours, Rose stood with a book balanced on her head, learning to walk with her spine straight, her shoulders back, her chin level. At first it felt ridiculous, artificial. But gradually, Rose began to understand what Mrs. Hartwell was teaching. This was not about imitating the aristocracy. This was about claiming space in the world, about moving through it as if she had a right to be there. You have spent your whole life trying to be invisible, Mrs. Hartwell observed one day, as Rose practiced walking across the small room. Making yourself small, unnoticed, apologizing for your very existence. Now you must learn the opposite. Not arrogance, mind you, but presence. The quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own worth. While learning to move with grace, Rose also learned to work with her hands in entirely new ways. Mrs. Hartwell began teaching her the fundamentals of haute couture, but these were not simple lessons. Every stitch had purpose and meaning. Every seam told a story. They started with basic techniques, Rose's calloused fingers learning to handle needle and thread with increasing delicacy. The nobility think gowns like these appear by magic, Mrs. Hartwell said, as she demonstrated a particularly complex embroidery technique. They do not see the hours, the skill, the artistry. They diminish what we do because recognizing its value would require them to acknowledge our worth. Rose discovered she had an aptitude for the work. Her hands, strong from years of scrubbing and cleaning, had the steadiness needed for detailed embroidery. Her mind, sharpened by years of observing the nobility from the margins, understood how fabric moved, how light caught on silk, how color could transform a silhouette. Under Mrs. Hartwell's patient guidance, Rose's skills grew from competent to accomplished to, eventually, extraordinary. But what the young woman didn't yet realize was that each stitch she learned, each technique she mastered, was not just creating a gown, it was weaving together her future and the Duke's reckoning. But Mrs. Hartwell taught Rose more than technique. She taught philosophy. A gown is not just cloth shaped to the body, she explained one evening, as they worked by candlelight, Rose's fingers flying through a particularly intricate pattern of silver thread on crimson silk. A gown is armor. It is shield and sword both. When you wear the gown you are creating, you will be telling a story without words. Make sure it is the story you choose. The months passed. Winter gave way to a cold, wet spring. In the world beyond Mrs. Hartwell's workshop, London continued its usual dramas. But in Whitechapel, Rose and her mentor worked in their small room, piece by piece, bringing into being something remarkable. The gown Rose was creating was not a copy of the one Duke Thornhill had mocked her with, though it was inspired by it. No, this gown was something else entirely. Where the Duke's gown had been designed to exclude, Rose's gown was designed to claim space. Where his had been impossibly fitted to make her failure certain, hers was tailored with such precision that it would fit her body perfectly, celebrating rather than diminishing her form. The crimson silk came from a merchant, Mrs. Hartwell knew, a man who owed her favours from better days. The thread was purchased with the last of Rose's savings, supplemented by what little Mrs. Hartwell could spare. Every inch of fabric was precious, every strand of thread accounted for. There was no room for error, no opportunity to start over. This made the work both terrifying and sacred. As Rose worked, she thought often of her mother. Margaret Bennet had been a laundress, her hands perpetually red and chapped from hot water and harsh soap, her back bent from years of labour. But she had possessed a fierce pride, an insistence on dignity despite circumstances. "Your worth is not measured by their opinion of you," her mother had told Rose countless times. The words echoed in Rose's mind as her needle moved through crimson silk with increasing confidence, as the pattern of thorns and roses began to emerge under her skilled fingers. "Your worth is inherent, God-given, unshakable." Rose's body changed too, not to fit society's narrow standards, but to grow stronger in her own skin. The physical labour of her servant's work, combined with Mrs. Hartwell's teachings about movement and carriage, created a different kind of transformation. Rose learned to carry herself with pride, to occupy space without apology. She was not becoming smaller to fit their mould. She was becoming more fully herself. The work was grueling. Rose's fingers bled from needle pricks. Her eyes burned from straining in candlelight. Her back ached from bending over the work table for hours. But with each completed section, with each perfect seam, Rose felt something growing inside her. Not pride in the arrogant sense, but a quiet certainty that she was creating something that mattered. One day, as spring turned toward summer, Mrs. Hartwell stood back from the nearly completed gown and smiled, a rare expression of approval from the stern seamstress. "It is extraordinary," she said simply. "You have created something worthy of a queen. But more importantly, Rose Bennet, you have become someone capable of wearing it. The gown is perfect, but it is perfect because you made it so. This is your triumph, not mine." Rose looked at the gown, at the hundreds of hours of work it represented, at the skill and care embedded in every seam. But Mrs. Hartwell was right. The gown was not the point. The gown was simply proof of what Rose had always been capable of, what the world had tried to tell her she could never be. "There is one more thing you need," Mrs. Hartwell said, disappearing into a back room and returning with a small wooden box. She opened it to reveal a delicate silver chain from which hung a small locket. "This was my mother's. She gave it to me when I entered royal service, and I want you to have it now, not as payment or obligation, but as a reminder that you come from a line of strong women, that your worth was established long before any duke tried to diminish it." Rose's hands trembled as she accepted the locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a determined chin. She looked like someone who would have understood, someone who would have been proud. "Thank you," Rose whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. "For everything, for believing I was worth teaching." "My dear," Mrs. Hartwell said gently, touching Rose's cheek with a calloused hand that carried decades of artistry. "I did not teach you worth. You already had that. I simply taught you to show it. How many of us carry the wisdom of mothers and grandmothers who taught us we were enough, even when the world said otherwise? Their voices live in us, guiding us through our darkest moments. Have you had someone who believed in you that way?" In the weeks that followed, Rose learned that Duke Edward Thornhill's reputation had taken some interesting turns. The scandal sheets had carried the story of his cruel game, embellished and expanded, transforming him from amusing rake into something closer to villain. Several business deals had fallen through when potential partners questioned his character. Lady Victoria Ashford, his cousin, had been heard complaining that his behavior was becoming troublesome. More significantly, Duke Thornhill himself had announced a spring gala, a grand affair to rehabilitate his image, to remind London society of his wealth and influence. It would be the event of the season, with an orchestra, champagne flowing like water, and the most exclusive guest list London had seen in years. Mrs. Hartwell heard about the gala from her network of former colleagues and servants, and she brought the news to Rose with a calculating gleam in her eye. "This is your moment," she said. "This is when you return. Not to seek his approval, Rose, but to prove something far more important, to prove to yourself that you were never what his cruelty tried to make you." Rose felt her heart begin to race. 6 months since that terrible night. 6 months of work, of transformation, of preparation. Was she ready? Could she really walk back into that world, that den of cruelty, and claim her dignity? If you've also been underestimated, if you know what it's like to be written off by people who should have known better, you understand the fear Rose felt in that moment. But you also understand the necessity of facing that fear, of walking back into the place that tried to break you and showing them they failed. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that dignity always wins. Your support helps us continue. She looked at the crimson gown, now completed, hanging on the dress form like a banner of war. She touched the silver locket around her neck, feeling the weight of generations of strong women. She thought of her mother, of Mrs. Hartwell, of all the women who had survived cruelty with their dignity intact. Your worth is not measured by their opinion of you. Her mother's voice, clear as if Margaret Bennet stood beside her. It is inherent, unshakable. The ballroom had been decorated with flowers imported from 3 continents, their perfume mixing with expensive cologne and champagne to create an intoxicating atmosphere. The orchestra was the finest in London, the refreshments were extravagant, and the guest list included everyone who mattered in society. Duke Thornhill himself stood near the entrance, greeting guests, his scandal now transformed into a rakish reputation that somehow made him more interesting rather than less. He wore a new coat of deep green velvet, his hair styled with the latest pomade, a peacock displaying his plumage to prove he remained magnificent despite recent whispers. The ballroom doors were open, and guests flowed in like a glittering river, each trying to outdo the others in elegance and expense. Lady Pemberton arrived in sapphires that caught the light like captured stars. Lord Beaumont's diamond stickpin was the size of a robin's egg. The wealth on display was staggering, overwhelming, a demonstration of power that seemed designed to remind the world of its place. And then the doorway darkened. Not literally, but metaphorically, as if the space itself held its breath. The orchestra continued playing for a moment, and then faltered, a few notes dying away as musicians turned to look. Conversations stuttered, stopped, reformed as whispers. Heads turned like flowers following the sun. Rose Bennet stood in the doorway. She wore the crimson gown, and it was perfection incarnate. The silk caught the light from 1,000 candles and seemed to glow from within, the colour of rubies, of blood, of sunset over the Thames. The cut was flawless, following the lines of her body with such precision that it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. The embroidery she and Mrs. Hartwell had laboured over for months now revealed itself in all its glory. Silver thread traced patterns of thorns and roses across the bodice, down the sleeves, along the hem, each stitch perfect, each design deliberate. But the gown, remarkable as it was, paled beside the woman wearing it. This was not the cringing servant who had scrubbed the gallery floor 6 months earlier. This was someone else entirely. Rose's hair was styled in an elegant sweep, held in place with simple pins that allowed a few strategic curls to frame her face. She wore the silver locket at her throat, and the simple jewelry somehow emphasized the sophistication of everything else. Her posture was perfect, her shoulders back, her chin high, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence that radiated from within. She moved into the ballroom with the grace Mrs. Hartwell had taught her, each step measured, claiming space, refusing to apologize for her presence. The gown moved around her like water, the silk whispering with each motion, and every eye in the room tracked her progress across the marble floor. The silence was absolute. Then, somewhere in the back, someone began to applaud. The sound was shocking in its loudness, breaking the spell, and suddenly others joined in. The applause grew, swelled, became something unstoppable, until the entire ballroom was filled with the sound of hands coming together, acknowledging not just beauty, but something deeper, something more significant. What was happening in that moment wasn't just about a dress or a woman's transformation. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel invisible, suddenly demanding to be seen. Together, we're witnessing something that reminds us of our own power to rise above cruelty. Rose's eyes found Duke Thornhill's across the crowded room. He stood frozen, his face pale beneath his carefully maintained tan, his mouth slightly open in an expression of shock so complete it bordered on comic. This was not supposed to happen. This was not part of the script he had written. Rose walked toward him, not hurrying, taking her time, allowing everyone to see her, to witness this moment. The applause continued, and now it was mixed with exclamations of admiration. Women were leaning toward each other, whispering about the gown, about the transformation, about the sheer audacity of it all. Men were reassessing their earlier judgments, their earlier participation in mockery now sitting uncomfortably in their memories. When Rose reached the Duke, she stopped. She did not curtsy. She did not lower her eyes. She looked at him as an equal, and in that gaze was everything she had learned, everything she had become. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the now quiet ballroom, 6 months ago, you offered me a challenge. You said if I fit into a royal gown, you would marry me. Duke Thornhill's throat worked, but no sound came out. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, eager to witness this confrontation, sensing that history was being made. "I did not come here tonight seeking your hand in marriage," Rose continued, her voice steady, clear, powerful. "I came to prove something far more important. You attempted to humiliate me with a challenge designed to be impossible. You wanted to demonstrate my unworthiness, to make me an object of mockery for your amusement." She paused, letting the words sink in, letting the assembled aristocracy remember their own participation in that mockery, letting them feel the weight of their complicity. "But what you actually demonstrated, Your Grace, was that humiliation defines not the person who suffers it, but the person who inflicts it. I did not need to fit into your gown to prove my worth. I needed only to claim it, to recognize what was always true, that my dignity, my value, my humanity were never dependent on your recognition." The ballroom was utterly silent now, every person present holding their breath, understanding they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for years, something that was changing the very air they breathed. This gown I wear was created by my own hands, guided by a master seamstress who understood that true elegance comes not from wealth or title, but from the certainty of one's own worth. Every stitch represents hours of labor, yes, but more than that, they represent a choice. A choice to not accept the limitations others tried to impose, to not believe the lies cruelty whispers. Rose touched the silver locket at her throat, drawing strength from generations of strong women whose blood ran in her veins. My mother died in poverty, broken by a life of service to people who never saw her as fully human. But she taught me something that no amount of cruelty could destroy. Rose's voice grew stronger, ringing with conviction that filled every corner of the vast ballroom. Your worth is not measured by their opinion of you. Your worth is inherent, unshakable, God-given. You are made of stars and strength. Instead, she stood taller, letting it fall, unashamed of her emotion, unafraid of appearing vulnerable, because true strength includes the courage to feel. So I thank you, Your Grace, for your cruel challenge. In attempting to break me, you gave me the motivation to become more fully myself. In trying to prove my unworthiness, you gave me the opportunity to demonstrate that worthiness was never yours to grant or deny. The applause that followed was different from the first wave. This was not the polite appreciation of a beautiful gown. This was recognition, acknowledgement, a kind of collective apology from people who suddenly understood their own culpability, their own participation in a system that diminished others for entertainment. It started slowly, one person, then two, then spreading until the entire ballroom was on its feet, and the sound was thunderous, shaking the crystal chandeliers, rattling the champagne flutes, filling the space with something that felt almost like redemption. Duke Edward Thornhill stood in the center of it all, and for perhaps the first time in his privileged life, he felt small. He looked at Rose Bennet, at this woman he had tried to crush, and saw reflected in her eyes everything he was not: humble, genuine, strong in ways that had nothing to do with money or title or the accident of birth. The shame that washed over him was so complete it was almost purifying. Someone in the crowd called out, "Shame on us!" and others took up the cry, not directed at the Duke alone, but at themselves, at their own participation in casual cruelty, at the system that made such cruelty not just possible but expected, entertaining. Lady Pemberton, who had laughed loudest 6 months ago, now approached Rose with tears streaming down her face, ruining her carefully applied cosmetics. "Forgive us," she said simply, the words inadequate but sincere, carrying the weight of genuine remorse. Rose looked at her, at all of them, at Duke Thornhill still frozen in his shock and shame, and she made a choice. Not forgiveness, perhaps, not yet, because some wounds need time, but something close to understanding, to recognition of shared humanity. "I do not ask you to carry guilt," Rose said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, reaching into every heart present. "I ask only that you remember this moment. Remember that every person you encounter, regardless of their station, carries within them the same inherent worth that I have claimed tonight. Remember that your power to diminish others is also your responsibility to lift them up. Remember that the world is shaped by our choices, made moment by moment, and that cruelty is always a choice, just as compassion is always a choice. We're all part of this story, aren't we? Every time we choose kindness over cruelty, elevation over diminishment, seeing people rather than dismissing them, we're rewriting the narrative of what humanity can be. As a community, we understand this truth." She turned then, beginning to walk back toward the ballroom doors, her exit as powerful as her entrance, but Duke Thornhill's voice stopped her. "Wait." The word was barely more than a whisper, but in the profound silence of the ballroom, it carried like a shout. Rose turned back. The Duke had found his voice, though it sounded different now, stripped of its usual arrogance, naked and raw with something that might have been the beginning of genuine transformation. "You are right," he said, the words clearly costing him something, as if each syllable was a piece of the armor he had worn his entire life falling away. "In everything you said, you are absolutely right. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. Let us know in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our upcoming stories. Leave your like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And before you go, check out the story I'm leaving here on the side. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect. Together, as a community that believes in the power of dignity, we understand that the world we create with our words and actions is a choice, made moment by moment, stitch by stitch. Rose Bennett understood this. Duke Thornhill eventually learned it. And now perhaps we carry that understanding forward too. The choice always is ours.